Welcome, everyone. Welcome, comrades. My name again is Sitembi Sopengu. I'm the director here at the Christian Institute. We thank you very much for everyone that has joined and the other comrades that are going to be joining us as participants and others that are going to be joining us through the live stream on Facebook, as well as what is going to be streamed by the Communist Party as well. I see now also we've been joined by Comrade Chris and Comrade Jenny and Comrade Reg. Welcome, comrades. And so we are continuing with this attempt by the Christian Institute to open space for really engaging in this very important discussion. And we were just having a conversation earlier with Comrade Asker and Rasika, and that of the importance of these platforms, you know, and why it is important that we continue on this kind of discussion to open this space for really providing alternative views, especially at this particular time. And I was noting there's an op-ed one wrote, I think about a week ago or 2 weeks back, about the almost the religious imposition of the Orthodox, and why it is important that we really robustly engage in this kind of discussion, but also to expand this beyond just the discussions to actual struggles that are happening in our communities with workers and many others, to really change the pendulum. And really to bring it out there in the public discourse that the Orthodox dimension is not the only one, and that even the field of economics is actually better even to call it political economy, to actually understand it as, I mean, it's not as some pure natural science, but that it is very much around the playing out of interest and how those interests are penned against each other, and so we are continuing on this track, and we are very glad that we have more comrades joining, and we are quite hopeful that as more of the comrades come and present and really expand the discussion with, I mean, we have Comrade Pat that is going to come in a few weeks to come. Hopefully, Comrade Bosi will also come, Comrade Neil and many other comrades. We have Comrade Chris next week. And so we are trusting that as we continue to do this, we will really build and expand the kind of space that for a progressive force that really is challenging this massive push of neoliberalism that is not just in South Africa, by the way. I mean, it is quite global. And so we are very glad today that we have Comrade Asker that is going to come and present for us. Just the general protocol is that for those of us who are not speaking, then we mute, and but we will have a time for questions. And then also a time for discussions later, and so we encourage everyone to stay and really to have your questions and your point of discussions ready for the discussion. I'm going to give quickly to Comrade Alex, who's just going to introduce for us Comrade Asker, and then Comrade Asker will take over. Comrade Alex.
Thank you, Dr. Bengo. You have given me a task that is so difficult, but I will try and simplify it from a record generated by Comrade Asker himself on one of his platforms. Comrade Asker has a long history of participation in economic development in South Africa. He is currently the Director and Chief Economic Modeler at the Applied Development Research Solutions, and has more than 20 years of experience in economic modeling. He has built a large-scale he has built large-scale economic models with user-friendly web interfaces to allow policymakers and analysts to design and assess the impact of policy choices and produce projections. Those of us who have had the privilege of working closely with him would have had another privilege of even entering data into the models to see the outcomes of the various economic policy scenarios. Particularly, he did a report from research conducted for the Department of Trade and Industry, offering quite interesting scenarios for the economy of South Africa. And that report was released last year in the midst of our discussions of the National Treasury paper that we rejected at the time. Comrade Asker has built for the Applied Development Research Solutions 6 macro, micro, and provincial economic models of South Africa that are available on the Applied Development Research Solutions website. That is http://www.adrs-global.com. He recently built for the ADRS Oceans, that is online country economic analysis system that includes economic models for 50 countries. The link to that model is also available on the ADRS website. And he has been a project director for UNU WIDER, in which he directed a major project on economic modeling for 10 African countries. He served as a senior economic modeler and research director at the National Institute for Economic Policy. And he served also as the senior lecturer at the University of the Witwatersrand, as well as senior policy advisor at the United Nations Development Program, South Africa. So let me end it there, because the rest will be a presentation of his history. Comrade Asker was the principal author and coordinator for the South African Human Development Report in 2003 and has written on macroeconomic, monetary and fiscal policy issues, poverty eradication, employment creation and economic modeling. Let's present Comrade Asker and allow him to take this digital platform to make his presentation. Welcome, Comrade Asker.
Oh, thank you very much, Alex and Dr. Bengu. Thank you for your invitation, and it's a pleasure to be with old friends, comrades, colleagues, and I look forward to to our engagement. And Alex, thank you for your generous introduction. I have I need to share my screen. I assume I'm hoping that I can do that. I think if you can please enable me to share the screen, then I can bring the presentation. Ah, here it is. Okay. Let's first make sure everybody sees the presentation. Is this visible now? Oh.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So I have this is a report that is coming out within the next couple of weeks. We, getting it ready to distribute. So I will send it to Dr. Bengu, and then he will make sure that send a copy to all of you, forward it to all of you. It's a joint report it did with Dr. Sambulo and also Joanne Beneke from Gauteng Economic Development. So we basically our starting point is that South Africa is suffering from a twin crisis. One is a healthcare crisis, COVID-19 crisis, the pandemic, which is accompanied by negative demand, supply, and price shocks, and The other is the chronic crisis that South Africa has been suffering, the persistent low growth, high rates of poverty, unemployment, and inequality. So therefore we raise two questions, having these two crises in mind. One is that what are the likely economic impact of the coronavirus pandemic? And secondly, what mix of short and medium-term policies are likely to mitigate the negative impact of the virus and propel the economy on a growth development path that yields inclusive growth? Now, to answer these questions, we use economic models of South Africa that we built. One of the models that we have built at ADRS is a linked national provincial model. This project, we've done it for the results. I'm going to today present you results at national level, but actually the project, the report provides you the results for the national, provincial, district, and municipalities. So the model we use is a linked national provincial model that basically replicates the working of the national provincial economy. It is linked to a household simulation so that it can look at the impact of changes in the macroeconomy and its impact on household welfare, who loses, who benefits, the impact on poverty distribution, the impact on the demand and cost of social security, the taxations and others, and then also the implication of the changes in the welfare and poverty distribution on the macroeconomy. So it captures the two-way interaction between the economy, the macroeconomy, and household, and then also it captures the link between the national and the provincial economy. It's a bottom-up, it's a sectoral model, and that we think that in terms of how it is developed, it tries to capture the laws of motion of the South African economy, and as a replicate of the economy, then we use it to do what-if scenarios. To project forward, to bring in forward-looking kind of likely impact of what those what-if scenarios. So we use this model to design scenarios and to get a kind of like a likely outcomes of various outcomes for South Africa over the next 10 years. Now, the first question, the first scenario that we use the model for is that we raise this question. If there were no COVID-19 and the status quo policy remained unchanged, what would have been the likely economic outcome for South Africa over the next decade? So we want to establish first a scenario, an outlook that without COVID, with the business as usual scenario. And by business as usual, we meant macroeconomic policy remain as it has been. It's actually more generous than currently being proposed, more of like staying within the 6% average annual growth of investments in nominal terms, government consumption expenditure of 7.5%. It has declined much less. It is much less now than it's being proposed. Public corporations investment grows average annually by 6%. Monetary policy continues to be strictly adhered to. Inflation targeting. Social policies remain as it has been. No expansion. EPWP phase 4 will continue. Will be introduced in a similar fashion. Continuation of the phase 3, and all other policies remain as they are. Now, we simulated the impact of this business as usual policy scenario and to see without COVID what would have been the outlook. So what we found is that, as you can see from here, 4 of the indicators: GDP, unemployment rate, poverty rate, and poverty gap. And what we find is that the economy will basically grow. The growth will be less than 2% on average over the next 10 years, slow growth. The unemployment rate will, by 2030, still would be 27.4%. The economy will grow by about 23%, and that means that average annual growth of less than 2%. Employment goes up by about 3 million, but the unemployment rate, given the population growth and would be still by 2030 would be about 27.5%, and poverty rate will decline by about 2% and still would be about more than 1/3 of the population would be below poverty line. So basically, the outcome of that scenario is an economy that will follow that past trickle-down outcome of low growth, high unemployment, high poverty. That's, that would be if there were no COVID and we were continuing our path. So the next question we raised was that what if the policy status quo remain unchanged even with the COVID-19? What would be the outcome? Now we want to introduce the COVID-19 to that business as usual scenario. Now to do that, we need to have scenarios for COVID-19 and we have to quantify those scenarios. So that meant engagement on trying to understand how COVID-19 is impacting South African economy. And we captured that into 6 scenarios. The scenarios are basically looking at 3 possibilities for South Africa in terms of low, moderate, and high scenarios for COVID-19. These are scenarios that are looking at the infection rates of the lowest would be about 0.5% of the population will be infected, about 300,000, and it goes up to it goes up to about 2% of the population. The focus of this scenario for South Africa is that what if there are low or moderate or high scenario for the COVID in South Africa, and with the initial with the impact on policies or implication that it has in terms of shutdowns, in terms of the social distancing, isolations that come with it, in terms of internally impacting the economy. It also includes the 6 scenario is from 3 scenario domestic and 2 scenario for the internationally, a moderate spillover effects and high spillover effects. So because South African economy is also impacted by the international factors that are and the COVID-19, therefore the severity of that, what is happening internationally, has implication for South Africa's, for example, trade, exports, imports, foreign direct investments, and prices, a number of price variables. So scenarios around that. Now, we had to translate this into a quantitative measures. So the next set of efforts was about trying to understand these 6 scenarios quantitatively. And what does it mean? What do each of these scenarios mean quantitatively? And here it's very important in the sense that what we have done is that we said in terms of those local scenarios that you have these 6 scenarios, 6 column scenarios, we looked at 4 variables that are domestically is being impacted, that are impacted the shocks that are initiated domestically: household consumption expenditure, investment expenditure, production, and employment. These are mainly because of social distancing, lockdowns, and obviously the impact that it has on production and it has on household consumption expenditure. These are initially local shocks. And under its scenario, the severity of those shocks, we developed assumptions about what would be the range of the impacts. And because the model is a detailed sectoral, we also took consideration of saying, for example, household consumption would be negatively impacted, and each scenario from about, from -3% to -12%. But it will be different between different types of categories of consumptions. Actually, some will be positive affected, some negative. So we have taken into consideration the impact that the shocks have on different categories of consumption. The same thing with investments or production or employment, even though the overall negative impact of the shocks and ranges from, like, let's say, investment with some -2.5% to 10% shock, depending on the severity. But the sectors are being affected differently because of the differences between essential sectors and non-essential sectors, and they're being impacted differently. So we have taken that into consideration. So there is a range of these. The shocks have also a range for each of the sectors. So this is 4 variables that are locally affected, shocks that are being shocked as a result of measures that are containment measures that are adopted locally. We also looked at 6 measures, 6 variables: exports, imports, exchange rate, gold price, oil price, and foreign direct investments, that are also impacted internationally from spillover effects that are due to the international shocks are impacting this. The pandemic is impacting South Africa through these channels, through these 6 channels. And again, those the same way as we quantified the other one, made assumptions about those, the impact, the potential impact of these under different scenario. We did the same exercise for each of these 6 variables. To what extent we think that under mild scenario, as opposed to higher scenario, severe scenarios, export is affected, imports or exchange rates and others. After doing this setting up these assumptions, these are educated assumptions based on other studies, based on UNCTAD, WTO, that says, how exports, imports, and sectors are being affected. So at this point, we are setting assumptions that the shocks, the magnitude of shocks, and the variations of shocks depending on the COVID. What we use the model for is that to take these assumptions around the shocks and they reverberate it through the economy and see the direct and indirect effects of these shocks, and then provides us the overall effects, the dynamic effects, the direct, indirect effects, add them all together and see what would be the impact. So the shock can be from demand side, but it will have supply side effect, or the other way around, or the price shocks will have both demands and supply effects. So the model then takes these assumptions around these shocks and give you the final impact or likely impact. So having that, then we said, well, what if now with these COVID scenarios, the business as usual policy stay as it is? What would be the impact on key variables? And here is some of the results that we find. That what you find is that the COVID-19 will have a major impact on the economy depending on the scenario. So here you have the scenarios are basically the red trend is your business as usual without COVID. And the 6 scenarios of COVID creates this, the rest of the trends are from the different various COVID scenarios. And here is for GDP, here is the unemployment rate. Again, here's the business as usual without COVID trend, where would have been how the economy would have evolved. And here is the employment on unemployment, what happens as a result of COVID immediately and afterward. Here's the poverty rate, and also for poverty growth. So what you find is that in terms of the overall picture is that the real GDP growth for 2020, immediate effects in other words, is likely to drop between minus 4.8% to minus 16.6%, about -5 to about 17, -17, depending on the COVID scenario. Unemployment rate is likely to increase to 35% to 40% in 2020, depending on the scenario. And the poverty rate is likely to increase by between 4 and 7 percentage points, increasing number of poor by between 2.5 and 4.5 million. Now, remember, the impact is much larger. There are about like 5.5 million more people are unemployed than is captured than this, the unemployment projection. But we're assuming that during the second half of the year, gradually people will start going back to work. So some of those who are become unemployed gradually go back or find jobs and go back to work. But the unemployment rate, the whole part of like 5 to 7% or so of the unemployment rate would go up, because they won't be able to basically lose their jobs. They're not going to be able to find a job immediately. In terms of post-COVID, what happens after 2020 is that it's also interesting that the economic transition will neither be quick nor uniform. It's going to be the negative impact of the pandemic is expected to persist in medium term. As you can see here, it drops significantly, but still it's still by 2024 or 25, it still takes several years for it to gradually reach the business as usual, even the business as usual outcome. And finally, what overall it tells us is that over time, economic indicators tend to gravitate toward the low growth, high unemployment, and poverty trends established by policy status. As you can see here, the policy status without COVID establishes that the red trend. The other ones, the drop, the indicators, each of them drop or increase, and gradually as they're coming back from that crisis, they gravitate toward that. In other words, over the next 10 years, the outcome is worse as for about half of that period, and at best, it will be close to what would have the business as usual scenario afforded you. In other words, that low growth, high unemployment, and poverty. Put it another way, we stuck with the business as usual policy scenario, we stuck with the low growth, high unemployment, high poverty, high inequality scenario over the next 10 years. And that's, you know, one of these that the simulation showed with the COVID-19. Now, the next question that we ask is, well, what if the COVID-19 changes the policy status quo? What policy mix is likely to mitigate the impact of the virus and propel the economy on a path that yields inclusive growth? Here, in order to provide the details of Developkent, what that policy mix looks like, we developed a 6 policy pillars. We examined different options and came up with a 6 policy pillar, which is a extension and similar to the one that was done for DTI with, you know, more, but now with the COVID-19 also added, and also another pillar which is about the provincial, which I will talk about as we get there. So the first pillar is about the macroeconomics. So I'm going to first take you through this policy mix, and then I show you the results that we get. In terms of macroeconomic policy reform pillar, there are 2 components to it. One is the mitigation measures, what needs to be done on macroeconomic policy now, and what needs to be done after the post-COVID-19 between 2021 and 2030. So immediately, in terms of the macro, we say that the 2020 budget medium-term austerity proposal needs to be set aside, since a suitable fiscal response to COVID-19 demands expansion, not contraction, of available resources to address the pandemic and its effects. Secondly, the government's budget for transfer spending needs to increase to properly fund for the expansion of Social Security, EPWP program. That is part of Pillar 2 we get to. There is a funding that needs to be provided for the Social Security mitigation measures that need to come to, and the fiscal needs to provide that. Additional 50 billion to government final consumption expenditure to support needs of the healthcare system, education, and other central, provincial, local government during the COVID-19. This is final consumption. So you have a transfer spending that needs to be increased to deal with Social Security. This is a goods and services spending that needs to increase as well. There is a need for increase in allocation of financial support to businesses, mainly in the form of tax benefits and business and subsidies designed to assist especially small, medium enterprises to make sure that they retain their employees. And also, we're saying that we need to immediately increase by 4% general government spending in social infrastructure budget to support increased COVID-19 related public health needs in terms of capital spending needs that need to take place so that for the preparation of reopening of a school and businesses. This is about, you know, clinics, building, whether it is about building clinics or hospitals or dealing with the schools, classrooms, changes on the capital infrastructure side of it needs to. And then reduction in interest rates and increase in low-cost borrowing part. In terms of this, between 2021 and 2030, post-COVID, the macroeconomic policy, what what we're suggesting is that the government and public corporations systematically need to increase their investment in economic infrastructure, social infrastructure, and economic services by 10% annually over the next 11 years, which is 4% above the business as usual scenario. Now, this 10% average annual increase is still lower than in 2020's period. In 2000s, the average annual growth rate that was the infrastructure investment was increasing. We need to increase the government current expenditures in the form of, relative to previous scenario, government annual current expenditure needs to increase by an additional 3% in order to provide more financial support for delivery of social services over the next 11 years. And in terms of monetary policy, the Reserve Bank needs to act to use monetary policy tools to contribute to the achievement of a higher growth target of 6%, with a higher target of 8% for the upper limit of the inflation targeting. So in other words, monetary policy needs to come and play a more active role in achieving, propelling the economy and higher growth and providing better access to finances. And also the credit extension needs to be substantially increased to from current about 7%, the annual increase to 15%. The credit extension to private sector, which is the business and household, in between 2000 and 2008, it was increasing by 15.5% annually. Now it is about 7%. In the past 8 years, it has reduced to less than half of that, to actually about 7%. So going back to have actually about 15% is actually nothing radical. It's actually it just has been the decline has been so drastic in order to help the economic activity. In terms of social policy pillar, this is the second pillar, is a social policy, and again there is a mitigation measures and the post COVID-19. In terms of mitigation measures that government needs to immediately introduce an unemployment grant for all who have become unemployed in 2020 and all other skilled unemployed that are in the economy. The eligible unemployed workers will be benefited, entitled to receive 1,000 rand per month. So that unemployment grant is both for current, for the impact of the COVID, and also for the skilled. For the unskilled workers, which are about 6 million workers, unemployed workers are unskilled, government suggests that government begins to make public works as an employer of last resort for the unskilled unemployed. And in 2020, increased the current EPW by about to capture about 33%, 35% of the unskilled unemployed, and then from the next year increased it again to reach about 70%, and from there increased by 3% annually, in order to by 2030 it will be covering all the unemployed, unskilled unemployed. Also, the Department of Social Development introduces a new single caregiver grant per family for a family member that take care of child who receives either a child support grant or a caregiver grant for 350 rands per month, and immediate increase of monthly child support grant to 500 given the price increase. All grants will increase annually. After, in terms of the post 2020 post COVID, what we're suggesting is, as I mentioned, the public works program continue to expand to cover the unskilled unemployed as an employer last resort for the unskilled unemployed. Caregiver grant that was introduced in 2020 is extended to after 2020, and the 350 rand monthly will increase by 6% annually. And the adult grant also, the post-COVID-19, the skilled unemployed can also apply for an adult unemployed grant to help them remain become active in the, remain active in the labor market. And after 2020, also that grant adjusts to about 6% annually, and all other grants also average annually adjust. So this is a combination of the social policy measures that are immediately for the mitigation measures and also post COVID-19. The third policy pillar is about the macroeconomic policy reform. Some of these are basically based on the modeling work that also Treasury did, and the suggestions that they put forward on measures that to increase labor productivity, competitiveness, prices, and some sectoral measures that they had. And we, at this point, we were basically saying, well, and from the modeling side, what they had done, well, let's look at what they said the impact of the policies they're looking at on the specific sectors or specific variables. We replicate that, and we actually simulated this last year, and to look at the impact of what they're proposing, and it basically adds about less than 0.5% to average annual growth rate. And from there, we built other pillars from there. The trade and industry pillar is basically focuses on basically the three issues: increasing investment in manufacturing sector. What if the policies that the trade and industry is following in terms of incentives and programs that they have to promote investment in manufacturing succeeds, to add about 10 billion in real terms annually to overall investment in manufacturing sector. Also a whole set of policies trying to promote trade, which is what if those will succeed, and tools such as SEZ measures, African integration measures, increase the total export by an additional 1.5% after 2020. And also, what if those measures that are focusing on reducing import dependency of ratio, improve localizations and succeed, and the import dependency ratio of sectors decline by 20% over the next 11 years. The fifth policy scenario, the fifth pillar of policy is about private sector support. And here is we incorporated into the scenario two measures, also the international private sector support. One is the PPGI, the Public-Private Growth Initiative, that is that's saying that they will spend new 500 billion over the next 11 years. What if that comes through, and the PPGI invest that amount over the next 11 years? And then second thing is that what if the Public Investment Corporation increases its investment in South Africa by 100 billion over the next 5 years in the manufacturing sector? And then also after the COVID-19, what if the level of foreign direct investment in South Africa gradually increases from 0.05% to 0.13% of the GDP between 2021 and 2030, and a couple of other smaller scenarios. Finally, we have the last pillar is about the provincial growth and development plans, and here the argument we made is that this pillar in principle needs to include bring in the policy, the growth and development policy program of all the 9 provinces. But to show the impact of it, the potential of this, we use Gauteng, growing Gauteng Together 2030, which is a medium-term program that has been put together. It was announced in February during SOPA. It was published in the detail of it. It includes about 160 interventions to promote industrial development, provide social services, improve social and economic environment of doing business. Basically, the provinces are very much involved in trying to get the economy going, and interventions that they are putting together. And as they're helping the province, they can also help the economy. And the same way they need the central government support in order to realize the goal. Like Gauteng GGT 2030 will only succeed if also the central government provide the supports that it needs to achieve those goals. So it's a two-way, basically, support. So we took that into those interventions. So what if those interventions are also succeed, and what type of contributions can, trying to capture the contribution of the provincial growth in the detail is in the scenario. So these were the 6 pillars of that we put together. There's 6 policy pillars that we said that we simulated, and here is some of the results that we get as a result of these. So with the 6 policy pillars, we able to mitigate some extent the impact of the coronavirus and help achieve inclusive growth outcome over the next 10 years. Here you see basically the mild scenario. This is now we are dealing with, depending on severe scenario or mild scenario, the outcome is obviously different. What we find that the 6 pillar bridge reduces the negative impact of COVID-19 on growth, employment, and poverty. So here what you see is the red, as I said, is the business as usual without COVID. The blue trend is the business as usual with COVID, and the green trend is the 6 pillar policy with COVID. So as you can see, those mitigation measures, the proposed mitigation of the simulation shows that the immediate impact is going to be less deeper. The impact of the COVID would be less deeper immediately in terms of growth and in terms of unemployment, and we'll see that in terms of poverty inequality as well. The duration, the transition period will become shorter than the blue, as you can see. And then also after, instead of staying within the confine of the business as usual trend, it also, this scenario allows the economy to go, to bypass, to go beyond the business as usual trajectory, the long-term trajectory. So therefore, it reduces the negative impact of the COVID on growth, employment, poverty, shortens the recovery period, as you saw here, and here is for the also for the mild scenario, produces average annual growth of over 6%, creates 8.2 million jobs over the next decade, reduces the unemployment rate by 2/3 to 13.5% by 2030. Remember, in the business as usual scenario, by 2030, the unemployment rate would be 27.4%, and here would be 13.5%. It lowers the poverty rate by 40% to 24%. In the business as usual scenario, it was the poverty rate was 34%. Here is 24%, and reduces the income inequality by 12%, by 11 percentage points. Here is the impact on poverty that you can see that by 2030, relative to this is the business as usual outcome, the poverty rate would be 10% lower, and the inequality would be lower, and relative to 2019 or 2020, it would be the decline would be more significant, as you can see. Now, I wanted to also show the result before concluding this, putting it all together, to show the impact of it on the debt GDP ratio, given all the discussions around the debt GDP ratio. If you look at the likely trend for the business as usual scenario without the COVID-19, the debt GDP ratio starting from 2000, say by 2030, in our estimate, the debt GDP ratio would have been about 67%. Now, there are 2 scenarios that we're looking at here, the mild and the severe scenario. And the business as usual scenario with the mild COVID-19, this will increase by 2030. The debt GDP ratio is estimated by about 73% and 76% under the severe scenario. It jumps up during currently as a result of not as a result of spending, but as a result of decline in the expenditure, in the revenue. the Treasury sometimes is talking about like as if like the debt is increasing now. It's like because of the spending that they're doing. It's actually because of the revenue decline, not because of the debt GDP jumping up, not because of expenditures or policy expenditures that they are proposing. Now, with the two scenarios that we have, the mild and severe scenario with the 6 pillars, what you have here is that as a result of the mild scenario, which is basically about 300,000 infections, and the scenario that we talk about, and then the severe scenario of 2%, much larger scenario. The debt GDP ratio, we are estimating that by 2030 would be 57%. And the debt GDP ratio as a result of the severe scenario with the 6 pillar policy would be 80%. So this is 80 as opposed to 76. And here is the we have a 57 the treasury with the mild scenario of COVID of 73 as opposed to 57% in our with the 6 pillar policy. The 6 pillar policies provide a lot more resources, a lot more from the social policy side, from macroeconomic spending, investment sides, and others in the program. But it helps economic growth, and that growth, the rise in the denominator of the debt GDP ratio, helps also reduce the debt GDP ratio over time. So it provides more. So it is a very different results or projections that the Treasury provides. What we are providing, which is not provided by for example, Treasury, is that under these is obviously certain growth outcomes. And we cannot talk about debt GDP ratio outcome without saying where does that growth come from? What are the results of their model for economic growth in the denominator? So we wonder if you ask for trends in the numerator and denominator that provides this, then one gets a better understanding of what are they thinking about the growth side of these things over the next 10 years. And how, and my sense is that they have a very dim view of the growth, and as a result, that very dim projection of like acceleration of the debt GDP ratio, because they're unable to generate growth. They're unable to put policies on not generating economic growth. It's only as a result of that GDP ratio is presented to explode. So. What does it mean altogether? This policy roadmap, the 6 pillar policy roadmap, we think it produces inclusive growth. Pretty mild inclusive growth, but relative to the business as usual, it is significant. In the sense that we say the poor will benefit from this 6 pillar policy because national poverty rate declines by about 40%. Poverty level declines over the next decade by 1/3, from 23 million to 15.7 million. Still, there will be about 16 million poor, but relative to now, there will be much significant decline, about the 1/3 decline. There will be significant improvement in delivery of social services, whether it's education, healthcare, land reform, others, and economic infrastructure. Due to the macroeconomic policy proposal, particularly therefore improve the living condition. These will increase the living condition of the poor families. The working class will benefit from the 6 pillar policies because the unemployment rate declined by more than 50%, from 35% to about 13.5% actually. The economy adds about 8.2 million jobs to total employment between 2020 and 2030. National income inequality declines by 11 percentage points, and those significant improvements in the social delivery of services and economic infrastructure also improve the living condition of the working class families. The business also stands to benefit from this high growth, high employment, because the total size of the economy more than double. And that means a lot more expenditure, a lot more demand for the goods and services that they produce. Average profit rate remains above 16% in our simulations. Improvements in the economy and overall well-being of the population improve average labor productivity. Government debt GDP ratio decline, as we, as I showed, gradually decline due to the high average annual growth rate. And average investment GDP ratio increases to 28%. An increase in the social cohesion, which enables the stable capital accumulation. We'll have much less poverty, inequality declines, much lower unemployment rate, and that improves the from the business class point of view, the helps capital accumulation. And so finally, basically, our goal was to identify a policy roadmap that effectively responds to COVID-19 induced economic crisis and South Africa's chronic crisis to achieve inclusive growth. The economic model allowed us to design and test economic impact of COVID-19 and policy scenarios. And we think that our proposed 6-pillar policy bridge provides a roadmap to inclusive growth. That's I mentioned about the team that has worked on this, the report that is coming out, and I'll look forward to make sure you all receive this and comments and any comments that you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Comrade Asker, for the quite expansive presentation. Firstly, we will just we will allow just any clarity questions, and so I will allow the comrades that are here. You can just use the system here to raise a hand. I see Comrade Rasikan already has a hand raised, and then I will also ask Comrade Debo to help us if there are any questions from the Facebook, and Comrades Amilcar and Zuva to help us with the those that are making chats and Q&A. So firstly, let me give over to Comrade Rasikan.
Thanks very much, comrades, and thanks so much, Asker. A really brilliant presentation. For now, I just wanted to get clarity specifically on the employment-unemployment vectors that you're looking at. I'm assuming you're using a narrow definition, and it's also not then differentiated by age. So I just raised that because it has very specific implications for us in terms of where we are with demography as well. Associated with that, Asker, is a second question. Again, it's a number question, and it's about the poverty rate itself. And the reason I asked this, you've seen there's some very good work. You've been involved in this as well around social wages and how public infrastructures, etc., offset actual cash in hand transfers. And the reason I asked that about how you have set the poverty rate is how then do we factor in the environmental and climate change issues that are going to be developed the next 10 years ahead of us. And it is going to influence whatever type of recovery we hope to pursue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Comrade Rasikan. Is there any other hand before I give over to Comrade Asker? I see here, okay, there's one question that I see here on the chat. It says, do you support the general economist estimation that economic costs will be around 13 billion rands per day? This in mind with massive increase in unemployment and livelihoods undermined, do you agree that government expenditure will need to increase significantly? This is asked by America. Maybe let's take this comment to Asker for now, and then we'll get more as we continue.
Okay. Well, thanks very much. In terms of the question about employment, unemployment, you are right. This is the official unemployment rate basically a strict definition of unemployment rate, basically used in for the that I presented. It doesn't, so it's a narrow definition. It doesn't differentiate in terms of age, breakdown by age of the unemployed. So that's, some of the limitation, which is also in your second question when it comes to poverty rate, the questions that you raise, and in terms of we use it's a income poverty that we estimate in the macro simulation part of the model. It does come with a very heterogeneous, it comes by race, by gender, by quantile, by localities in provinces and all those things. That poverty is estimated in more detail. I just gave an overall, and it is different. The impact is very different from one to other. But it doesn't, some of the issues you raise is not, it's basically income poverty. And in terms of what you said is important, in the paper we also mentioned that as part of that's the last things in the section in the paper about limitations of this. One of the limitations is what you mentioned in terms of we're doing simulation over the next 10 years, and we're not doing scenarios about the environment. What would be those, the global, threats from, from changing in the environment situations. And the other issues, for example, is also there is also possibility that the COVID-19 will go and then come back again, recur again, and we don't take that into consideration. So we wanted to just have a two kind of like keep certain things as they are, look at the policies from from business as usual as opposed to these 6 pillars, but these are, it's also important to note, which you all know, these are policy scenarios, modeling scenarios. These are what if scenarios. It easily can be adjusted. It can easily, if we put our mind together, we definitely can develop more interesting or elaborate or other what if scenarios or shades of each of these scenarios. So if you look at it from that possibility, I think then it is not an ultimate scenario. No, it is to indicate that there are a mix of policies that can give us different results, but it is not the only policy mix that is there. So we're clear on that in the report as well. So it's indicative in that sense. The last question was about do I support, I don't know about that 13 billion per day and how it's calculated, what it is, but in terms of the principle of it, in terms of government needs to spend in order to, as a mitigation, dealing with the current crisis, yes, that is everywhere in the world. That is what is happening. It has to happen. People are being drastically affected, losing their jobs, losing their businesses. People are falling into poverty, and a lot of these businesses that are closed, people cannot go back to work. So ultimately, governments are responsible for the people, for the well-being of the people, and the well-being of the people in each country is threatened by this virus. So there is all the efforts in my view has to be made, and monetary side of it is only one aspect of it that is important and needs to be, we're living in a monetized economies. People for their livelihoods need access to finance, access to money, and these, whether it is social policies, to grants and others, to business supports, others, and it is happening across the world. So when we're being told that the deficit is dropping significantly, it is happening everywhere in the world, because revenues, because of shutdowns, because businesses are unable to pay taxes, the revenues of all the governments are declining, and as a result, their deficits, at least temporarily, is increasing. But then on top of it, obviously, the different governments are also embarking on what the population needs, and to to save lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Asker. So now we are open for discussion, comrades. So we can all engage. Maybe let me take the opportunity to throw the first bite. Comrade Asker and others, I think there's been, I think over the last few months, it is clear that this crisis needs a lot. But the challenge that seems to be quite prevalent, especially from our treasury and those who support them, I made this point also last week, seems to be the assumption or the framing of the national economy on the basis that we don't have money. And so we are then told that we don't have money, so let's buckle up. Supposing, I mean, in a way, almost like in my family household, when my kids ask for a bicycle and my income has been reduced, so then I tell them that, sorry boys, I can't afford to buy you bicycles this year. So how do we get out of this frame? This seems to be the overarching frame that is governing a lot of our treasury policy decisions, even with the budget review or the budget revision. In fact, it's very much even more austerity on top of further austerities and those kind of things. And this narrative quite seems to be quite prevalent that the South African household, the household called South Africa, we have overspent what we can, and so now it's time to pull our belts in. So maybe if we can just, really at a broader level, what are the responses to these kinds of narratives that are being painted up there? I see there's a hand by Hamida. Yes, Comrade Hamida.
Hi, thank you very much, Comrade, and thanks, Asghar, for your really insightful and astute presentation. I think I want to pick up on both what Comrade Stembuso has raised, as well as a question that Comrade Jenny has put forward. I mean, in terms of how do we actually get a different discourse articulated on the ground and get people to understand that there are alternatives, right? And I think a link to that question is, I mean, whose interest is being served here? I mean, it's clear if you look at the symptoms of what such a trajectory is leading to. We can see the annihilation of workers, we see high levels of unemployment, we see massive implosion, crime is going to increase. So this particular trajectory that we're on, that's being fostered by government, is clearly not one that's beneficial to the majority of us, and particularly from a worker's perspective, not even for workers, right? So whose interests? I think we need to really start interrogating whose interests are being served, so that we can then start at, apart from just articulating the alternative economic model, that we can actually start holding people to account and exposing the atrocities. Thanks.
Thanks, Comrade Jenny. Thanks, Comrade Hamida. Any other one who wants to take a bite before I give to Comrade Asker? I see there's no one so far, so go ahead, Comrade Asker.
Okay, well, thanks very much. I think you guys are touching some very important issues. There've been two misconceptions that has been promoted over the years, not just in South Africa. Well, the second one is new, but the first one has been promoted around the world, which is that basically government is like household. If you spend more than your income, you'll be in debt. And therefore you have to manage your spending in order to remain within the budget that you have. It's a misconception, because government is not like household. Government income is from tax revenue and tax is a function of government, the economic performance, economic growth. The faster the economy grows, the more tax revenues are collected. The government can also change tax rates and tax policies to generate more income. For example, wealth tax in South Africa introduced to increase its revenue. But even with the status quo as it is, as if the economy grows, your revenues are stuck. You're stuck with low growth. That means low revenue. So the household, the government is the income, and therefore its spending is also depends on the economic growth. And the other important part of this puzzle is that, to the extent that the government, therefore the government can also help its own income by helping economic growth. So if government is spending, whether it is public investments, whether it is in social spending, in education, and others, measures that will help economic growth, not tomorrow, but it can be, some of these can be like education over time, that will pave the way for more revenue to come to government and expand its income. So that issue is very important, because that makes, therefore, the government should be looked at actually, that it is spending can be like investment, like the private sectors, like the households that you invest, you buy a house or you buy a private sector invest in order with the intention of producing and later on paying its debt. It can, if it is invested, if it is spending to help economic growth, it is able to pay back its debt. So debt and government is not government is not like household, because of its ability to because of its link to the economic performance and its ability to help and impact economic performance, and therefore its own revenue, its own income. The second misconception that is being, I see that it is being now being promoted, is that government spending does not help economic growth. There is zero multiplier effect. This is, I think, relatively new. It seems like they're pushing that line. That this is, the government spending in the past 10 years or so did not help economic growth. I haven't seen research on it. I haven't seen that they're saying that. And I think there are ample evidence internationally in South Africa that this is not the case. It's not the case that the government, the multiplier effect of government spending, current or the capital spending, is zero or negative. So that's also, we've got to definitely, deal with those issues. On the issue of, I think the issue that Hamida raised about whose interest is being served. Look, the economic policies, we were talking about this earlier before the session started. These orthodox economic policies, these Washington consensus policies that have been, gear basically policy, the shift that took place some years back to these policies, are basically give the main beneficiary of that, the dynamics that it generates, or the kind of economy that promotes, is the private sector, the capitalist class. This is basically evident from the worsening of income inequality, the cutting down of the governments, from capable state development state to minimal estates, the reducing tax rates on businesses, reducing social programs and around the world. All of these have created more and more inequalities and concentration of wealth and inequality and more vulnerability, which actually the COVID-19 has actually exposed significantly, that the vulnerability of the massive population around the world to a pandemic, and how vulnerable they are in terms of their livelihoods, how vulnerable the system is for them. It is there is definitely a class interest in the analysis that in terms of policies. These policies are not neutral. They're not just economists debating between themselves. They represent. They are, it's not coincidental that these, structural adjustment programs are being supported by large international institutions, and also private companies like Goldman Sachs and others have supported these policies over the years. These, whether it is about privatizations, whether it is deregulations, whether it is the monetary policy being, strict, the inflation targeting policies, whether low deficit, small governments, these are supported by the rating agencies that represents basically the investments of big companies and others. It is promoted by international institutions and others. So this is not coincidence. The policies basically that what we're talking about, this contestation, is a manifestation, is a dimension of a class struggle that is taking place as internationally. Now, Hamida, what I would like to add to this is that what I'm observing from far away, what is happening in South Africa, thanks to all of you coming together, the struggle that's going place with Neil and his the efforts that they're putting together, the other NGOs, I think there is a new phase going on right now. We have to recognize that I think they are the collective, they're in a more collective response than compared to individual response to these, policy problems. And I think it is, even the government is finding it, the Reserve Bank or Treasury finding it uncomfortable because they're not used to being, having large number of economists writing and saying this policy needs to be put aside. So I think there's a really good work, and it seems to me that it has it's entering a new phase, which is hopefully expands from there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Comrade Asker. There's a question here, Comrade Asker, from Florencia, and it says, is it possible that the effect of government spending on economic growth is offset by the levels of corruption in government? In other words, lots of spending, but much of it goes to an elite and funneled for private ends. How does capacity to manage within the state affect these scenarios? So that's a question from Florencia. Let me just, before I give to Comrade Asker again, just see if there are any hands, comrades, for comments, discussion, questions. So maybe let me give again, Comrade Asker, just to respond to that.
Comrade Stay?
Yes.
Yeah, it's Alex. I just want to make, my apologies.
Yes,
I have a low bandwidth where I am now. I think that the point raised by Comrade Asker, that there is something developing in South Africa at the moment, it's an important question that all of us have to build a united front around. Clearly, it is correct, that observation, that the Reserve Bank and perhaps even the National Treasury have not operated in the recent past in an environment such as the current one, where there is a growing voice, and that voice is from different walks of life calling for change, while building technical and professional capacity and putting forward proposals for economic policy change. The observation by Comrade Asker is so important that we need to work together at some point, as soon as it is safe, to push forward our views through rolling mass mobilization. At this moment, under the coronavirus restrictions, we use the digital space, but at some point, as soon as it is safe, it is going to be more important to push for a policy change through class struggle, because capital finds its views in national treasury policies, where the views of the people affected by the crisis levels of unemployment, poverty, and inequality do not find expression. Clearly, we are dealing with a state that is pushing a particular orientation, and for that orientation to change, we've got to deepen and widen class struggle to a point where that orientation can't be implemented, like the policies that Comrade Asker referred to as promoted by a variety of global or international institutions. In South Africa, the Paris-based OECD and the Paris Club, the IMF, Goldman Sachs, the ratings agencies seem to have gained control over our democracy, over our voices, to a point where our national treasury is their spokesperson. I mean, when you look at the national treasury, so-called towards economic transformation for South Africa, that document is actually auctioning off state control of key assets in communications, in the railway infrastructure, in the ports infrastructure, in water, in energy. Everything has to be given to the private sector for accumulation and for competition. This is summarized in about 3 words. It's called private sector participation and competition. And in order for that to be advanced, the state is being weakened, and there is nothing being proposed for the working class. Where they talk about inclusive growth, their reference is to SMMEs. And that document says, as part of its inclusive growth trajectory, actually employers who can comply with the very national minimum wage should no longer apply for exemption. It is liberalizing the labor market, and so it is not difficult to see whose class interest such a policy is saving. And there is this equitization and partial or full privatization of SOEs. If you look at the presentation made by the National Treasury to Parliament last week, that presentation is privatizing state-owned assets either in whole or in part, and is weakening the state sector. One of the things that we will have to be strong at is not to allow references to corruption to be used to give advantage to the capitalist sector and to disadvantage the working class. So class struggle is the way forward in South Africa. And the work done by Neil Coleman's Institute for Economic Justice, by economist Tumatubule, by economist Rachinkosi, by other comrades like Pat Horn in the informal sector, all those efforts have to be consolidated, and the trade union movement has to unite. And at some point, we've got to take the thinking that prevails in the National Treasury head on and stop it, and once for all. Yes, that is the comment.
Thank you, Comrade Alex. Comrade Asker.
Well, thanks very much. I have there was a question about the capacity of the state,
Yes,
and the issue of the corruptions. Obviously, I mean, if the corruption continues, anti-corruption measures and has to be, always in, push for. We need to push for that. We have to make sure. I'm not sure if we can achieve that 100%, or it is possible. There's a lot of not the public sector, private sector. The corruption's endemic in certain ways, but it is, the state needs to be, striving to be clean, to be, corruption free, so that the taxpayers' monies are being, having the expected impact. but it's important to also note that the state has been, some of its capabilities has been reduced, and that needs to be built. The developmental estate needs to be built, and the fact that if it is weak now doesn't mean that therefore we cannot do it. That issue, that task always has to be on the list of what needs to be done. Building, reinforcing, building the capacity, and in our case, in this issue of policy, building capacity for policy analysis, for engagement. I mean, we're bringing today the sixth pillar of this scenario is about bringing in the provincial development, growth and development plans into the policy making. They need to be around the table for brainstorming what policy to implement, what they need, and how they can help. So there's a lot needs to be done on policy capacity building of the state, the central government, and the rest, in terms of that, and that needs resources, that needs investments, and that will pay off in terms of having a state that can respond to pandemic, respond to the environmental crisis, respond to any other unexpected shocks, and also dealing with the crisis, the pandemic crisis, of the chronic crisis of the unemployment, poverty, inequality. So that's the other issue I wanted to say about the current engagements. I very much support what is happening and the collective actions that is taking place. I like that to also to point to say that the problem of South Africa also is the overall economic policy. Yes, the issue of the budget is something that is crucial right now. But I think we need to continuously, in our engagement, raise the issue of the overall economic policy. It is not so. It's not just about the budget. The fight is not just about the budget. It's about the macroeconomic policy in general. It's about a range of policy issues. So with social policies and others that need to be, taken on board. So I worry about if we focus only on the issue of the budget, we will not be able to. We will. The longer term fight is on the continue to be on the economic policy. Finally, I wanted to say something. The issue of what Alex brought up. Look, I think there's a lot more that can be done by organized social forces of COSATU, SACP unions. For years, I think they do support the stance that we're talking about, but I think it needs to be a lot more active and a lot more pronounced than it has been. The cadres it is not like the case that right now these 6 pillar policies. I mean, last year we had this 6 pillar policy, another version of this we put out. The DTI really did not come out and supporting it, even though the report was for the DTI. So I think there are problems there, and I think it's been whatever it is, tactical issues that is there. Whether we have Minister of Labor, we have Minister of Education, there are others who are supposed to be the progressive forces in this government, and then we have So what I'm saying is that the status quo involvement of these alliance members, the way it has been the last 20 years, maybe needs to also be relooked and see whether they have had enough of this, that they can now take more pronounced role, or it is being left to social active NGOs and others, progressive individuals and others to do the fight. To what extent really they come to table and really spearhead this, because everybody needs that backing. I mean, there's a need for really organized forces to be able to back these efforts that are being done. So I leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Comrade Asker. There's just also one hand now by Comrade Paddy. Let me just give him a chance to. He's been raising a hand up for quite a while. Comrade Paddy.
Thank you very much, comrades, and thanks, Asgar. I think this is an important presentation, and the issues raised here are not new. I think the action that has been taken by the economists and right into Parliament not to approve the budget was also raised by Professor Ben Turok 30 days before he died. So COVID is not necessarily the main thing, but what we have to ask ourselves is why COVID has become so important and everybody is now panicking. Unemployment kills the children of the poor and affects the poor. Inequality is a disease of the poor. So is poverty. COVID, unfortunately, it is not. And that is why there is this panic, because the rich are equally affected and they don't have a cure for this. So if we miss this opportunity to get and correct the wrongs, COVID is unlikely to come again. So that's one point. The second point certainly is that, which gets back to the policy issues in South Africa and what they deliver is not something that is new. It's something that has been there for a very long time. For us to have tolerated unemployment at 27% for so long really doesn't answer the question why unemployment is an important issue, just as debt to GDP ratio, especially when that debt is taken for non-productive assets. So unemployment is as important, and we cannot have a one indicator objective where we only say, well, debt to GDP ratio, that's where the problem. Besides, the investment that we have to look at and look for has to be one that is done largely by South Africans. Where we are, whether debt to GDP ratio drops to 30% or whatever, foreign businesses are not going to invest in South Africa. Investments will have to come from South Africa itself. It will be a long time before debt to GDP ratio drops to where things become very, very attractive. And they'll be attractive to the extent only that is financialization, not the real economy where you have to sink a mine, deal with agriculture, revitalize manufacturing. In the 6-pillar policy strategy, you will realize that the growth actually emanates largely from these activities from pillar 1, pillar 2, pillar 3, and then of course pillar 4 from the private sector, but largely private sector in South Africa. Foreign direct investment is still very, very tiny. And to worry about debt to GDP ratio, it's really a serious anomaly. It's a misplaced scarecrow. And of course, Treasury, long before the revised budget, raised that scarecrow of debt to GDP ratio. We cannot be managed by one indicator. We have to ask, if we have a low debt to GDP ratio, or whatever debt to GDP ratio that they project, where will there be employment, where will poverty be, and where inequality will be? And all those four must be in the pot when arguments are made. I don't think I've seen in the current discourse, even in Parliament, an argument saying, but what will happen to employment and what will happen to poverty? Treasury, by its own admission in the Towards Transformation paper in August, brought to in their modeling, a filthy 1 million jobs, where we have 10 million unemployed, and that million jobs come after 10 years. The State of the Nation address brought double that number. But when we have 10 million people unemployed, and in 10 years, that number will rise to 16 million, 2 million will not make it, will not cut it. So looking at those indicators, certainly the public must say, we can't follow this path that leads us to nowhere, to more unemployment, to more poverty, to more inequality, in the name of debt to GDP ratio. So I think, if I may be helpful, and having been in government, and having sat there at the highest level of civil service, the system doesn't have tools that you can use to plan. What we do as DGs is to put files on top of the other, and we say we have integrated. You can quote me on this one, because there are no systems that generate the kinds of plans that can be looking ahead, like what Asger has presented. The kinds of things that are presented to Parliament through the MTSF is 3-year cycles, which actually addresses financialization, not a development path at all. And if we don't have those tools, we'll talk RDP, we'll talk GEAR, we'll talk ASGISA, we'll talk New Growth Path, we'll talk Kauleza, we'll talk New Dawn, we'll talk the 9-point plan, we'll talk all those things. They will only be talk, because you don't have the tools to actually activate the kinds of thoughts that we are having. And in those tools, what we have to do is to upfront be assured of whether those things that we are saying are possible. And it's only when we have those tools and we have the people who are capable at the provincial, at the municipality, at the national level, that you can start addressing these things. Without that capacity and capability to deal with these tools, we are not going to go anywhere. Apartheid had those kinds of people, and it had those tools. We don't have those tools, and we don't have those people. And for as long as that is happening, corruption will take root, because we don't have tools that can navigate upfront what is happening. So I leave it there, Chair. So side by side with public mobilization and the like, you need a warhead that deals with these things at the technical level. Otherwise, capital will always come and say you don't have capacity, and you can't plan. We've been planning all the time, and I'm saying those that we thought were plans were never plans at all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Comrade Paddy. Very useful comments. There's another comment here from Comrade Jenny, which says long-term integrated planning for development path is absolutely critical to turn this around. Comrade Paddy, it's all right. He has long been telling us to use statistical analysis in our planning. So maybe let me just give again, Comrade Asger, for the last bite before we can move towards the closing.
Oh, thank you very much. I think Paddy, summarized the issues, eloquently, and I can only say that we also add that we are trying to also put together some training program, at least on some of these scenario development, what if scenarios, and making these tools available, and do some training, introduce some training for courses, so that we engage this in a wider scope in South Africa. But I think I think yesterday Paddy wrote an article which I really suggest everyone to read if you haven't, which is, I think he puts it in much better than I did, in terms of what we're trying to say, that while we're fighting about the fiscal policy issues currently, we have to contextualize, continuously bring the issue of the issue of employment, the issue of the growth, the issue of the poverty and inequality, and not to limit the conversation or allow that to be narrowed to the issue of the can we afford this? Can we not afford it? Do we have the money? Don't we have? That's it. Is it to become only about debt GDP ratio deficit? And I think that article is very nicely put that together. And I think that is what we're trying to say. Look, we got to fight this in multiple fronts, and not to allow it to be pigeonholed into a discussions of just the budget issue. So thank you very much. I really appreciate the invitation. I very much enjoyed our conversation, and I'm sure it's going to go on and continues. And I wish you all the best. Something happened to the...
Oh, sorry, my mic was still muted. Thank you very much, Comrade Asker, and thank you very much, comrades, for this session. By the way, when the Comrade Party was speaking here, I just remembered that we don't only have him, we have also Comrade Jane here, who are, we can say, retired or former senior civil servants. And I remember that there's a friend of mine in KZN. We always had this discussion with him, how it would be so useful, some of our comrades, either who were senior civil servants or even senior officials, to actually write more reflective of their experiences in these offices, and of which we don't have much of that. Maybe part of it is because others, they leave government to the private sector, and or many other things that are there. But I mean, just taking by the comments that were made by Comrade Party here, and some of the conversations one has heard from the party with Comrade Jane and other comrades, it's quite critical. I think it will be such a good contribution, really, if that can be a trend, really, for this kind of comrades to actually make a real intentional, reflective writing on their experiences in the state, and the kind of challenges and the kind of things that really are necessary to build the kind of capacity that is necessary. And by the way, I must just mention that we are continuing. So next week we will be having a presentation by Comrade Chris Malikane, of which we are working in the rounds. Hopefully that can be followed by Comrade Pat Horn. I was still going to engage privately Comrade Busi to also prepare something, to actually to also present here. But in the conversation of she's been quite keen, even though I'm now launching her without necessarily having spoken to her as yet, but generally, under general, she was quite keen. And so, but I think there are quite useful points that came from this session, and I think they have come in the other sessions as well, around really the significance of class struggle, the significance of being able, of how do we advance these kinds of engagements beyond just seminars and writing, to actually cascade them and to build actual struggles on the ground in the communities, in the various formations that are there. And I remember in the first one, in fact, one of the points that came out from our very first webinar was actually some kind of an agreement, was some kind of a point that what might be necessary actually might be to develop, let's say, a 15-point program, 10-point program, essentially identify cardinal fundamental things that we are, all these various formations that we agree on. and they don't have to be many, but start with the ones in which there is general consensus around which it can be quite easier to build a much more broad-based consensus to actually build a movement around it. And so probably as we continue, these probably should be some of the things that we should be engaging in around how really do we then, what kind of avenues and what kind of struggles and what kind of avenues are necessary to really build these broader struggles which enable all these various formations that are progressive, even though we might have differences, but to really have a common agenda and common program around which we can be able to rally around. And so I think we will encourage comrades to also begin to think around those as we continue, and hopefully some of these webinars will actually be able to begin to lead us into those kinds of discussions around how do we do that. And so on that very note, comrades, thank you very much again. Comrade Asker, thank you very much. We are very much looking ahead for your paper, and hopefully in the meantime we can just be able to have this presentation. Already there's a number of people that have asked for it, and so comrades, let's meet again next week, and with where we have a presentation by Comrade Chris Malikane. Thank you very much, comrades. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you.
Comrades.
Thank you very much. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ntatele Hosa. And thank you, comrades, all of you. You know, I can see we are going towards a revolution now.
Hey.
We hope so, Comrade Alex.
Towards a revolution now.
Going towards, we are in a revolution now.
Yeah, I can see we are at the doorstep now.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you, Comrade Jenny.
Thanks, Comrade Alex. Take care. We like your new office.
Much appreciated. Thank you. I will be doing a 3-hour drive now.
Please drive safe. Please drive safe.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, take care.
Thank you, bye, comrades.
Thank you.
Bye, Comrades Tembiso, thank you very much. Very much appreciated. On
yes,
that last
the Chrisani Institute, you know.
We need to pull those issues together so that we're able to reflect on that program. It's critically important.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Indeed.
But thanks very much.
Thank you, Chrisani Institute.
Drive safe, Mchan.
Okay, take care. Bye.
Thanks, bye.